Chapter 12. Gunplay. Under the banner headline, Williams Charged in Slaying, the story itself was very brief. It said that at 3 a.m, police had been summoned to Mercer House, where they found Danny Hansford, 21, lying dead on the floor in the study, his blood pouring out onto an oriental carpet. He had been shot in the head and chest. There were 2 pistols at the scene. Several objects in the house had been broken. Williams had been taken into custody, charged with murder, and held on $25,000 bond. 15 minutes later, a friend of Williams had arrived at police headquarters with a paper bag containing 250 $100 bills, and Williams was released. That was all the newspaper said about the shooting. Williams was identified as an antiques dealer, a restorer of historic houses, and a giver of extravagant parties at his showplace home, which Jacqueline Onassis had visited and offered to buy for $2 million. About Danny Hansford, the paper gave no information other than his age. The next day's newspaper carried a more detailed account of the shooting. According to Williams, he had shot Danny Hansford in self-defense. He and Danny had attended a drive-in movie, he said, and returned to Mercer House after midnight. Back at the house, Hansford suddenly went wild, just as Williams said he had done a month earlier. He stomped a video game, broke a chair, smashed an 18th century English grandfather clock. Then, just as he had done before, he grabbed one of Williams' German Lugers. But this time, he did not fire it into the floor or out into Monterey Square. This time he aimed it directly at Williams, who was sitting behind his desk. He fired 3 shots. All 3 missed. When he pulled the trigger to fire again, the gun jammed. That was when Williams reached into his desk drawer and took out another Luger. Danny was struggling to unjam his gun when Williams shot him. Later in the week, Williams elaborated further in an interview in the weekly newspaper, the Georgia Gazette. His tone was confident, even a little defiant. "If I had not shot Danny," he said, "it would have been my obituary that was published." Williams said the movie at the drive-in had been a violent horror film. Lots of throats being slashed and that sort of thing. I told Danny we should leave and go play backgammon or chess or something, and we did. By the time Williams and Hansford arrived back at Mercer House, Danny had smoked 9 joints and consumed a half pint of whiskey. They played a video game for a while, and then a board game. At that point, Hansford launched into an irrational tirade against his mother, his girlfriend Bonnie, and his buddy George Hill. Suddenly, in a flash of anger, he stomped the video game control panel. "Games!" he screamed. "It's all games! That's what it's all about!" Williams stood up to leave the room. Hansford grabbed him by the throat and threw him up against the door jamb. "You've been sick," he said. "Why don't you just go off someplace and die?" Williams wrenched himself out of Hansford's grip and went into his study, where he sat down at his desk. He heard loud crashing noises, the grandfather clock falling to the floor, glass breaking, and other sounds of destruction. Danny came into the room carrying a German Luger. "I'm leaving tomorrow," he said, "but you're leaving tonight." With that, he took aim at Williams and fired. Williams said he felt the breeze as one of the bullets passed his left arm. Then Danny's gun jammed. Williams grabbed his own gun and fired. After Danny fell, Williams put his gun down on the desk, walked around the desk, saw that Danny was dead, then went back behind the desk and called a former employee, Joe Goodman. Williams told Goodman he had just shot Hansford and to come to Mercer House right away. After that, Williams called his lawyer. Then he called the police. Williams' lawyer, the police, Joe Goodman, and Joe Goodman's girlfriend all arrived at Mercer House at the same time. Williams was standing in the open door. "I just shot him," he said. "He's in the other room." The first policeman to arrive on the scene, Corporal Michael Anderson, recognised Danny immediately. Corporal Anderson was the same policeman who had come to Mercer House a month earlier to take Danny into custody after his previous rampage. On that occasion, he had found Danny upstairs, stretched across the bed, fully clothed. This time he found him lying on a Persian carpet in William's study, with his face in a pool of blood. His right arm outstretched above his head, his hand cupped lightly over a gun. Towards 7 a.m, the police escorted Williams to headquarters. They fingerprinted him, booked him for murder, and set the bond at $25,000. Williams went to a telephone and called Joe Goodman, who was still waiting back at Mercer House. "Joe, now listen carefully," he said. "Go upstairs to the tall cabinet in the organ room. Stand on the chair next to it, reach up, and take down a paper stack that's sitting on top." 15 minutes later, Goodman arrived at police headquarters with a brown paper bag containing 250 $100 bills, and Williams went home. A few days later, the police announced that certain lab tests would show whether or not Danny Hansford had actually fired a pistol, as Williams claimed. The crucial test would be the presence or absence of gunshot powder on Hansford's hands. If gunshot residue could be detected, it would mean Hansford had fired his gun before Williams killed him. The absence of residue would mean he had not fired. Police said the results would be ready in a week or so, and could make or break the case against Williams. Despite having the heavy charges hanging over him, Williams went calmly about his affairs. On Wednesday, 4 days after he shot Hansford, he asked the court for permission to fly to Europe on an antiques buying trip. The judge raised his bond to $100,000 and let him go. In London, Williams stayed at his favourite suite in the Ritz and played roulette at the Crockford Club. Then he flew on to Geneva to attend a sale of a Fabergé. He returned to Savannah a week later. Soon afterward, the police announced that lab tests would be delayed because of a backlog of work at the Georgia Crime Lab in Atlanta. A month later, the police were still awaiting results. In the meantime, people in Savannah were coming to conclusions of their own without the benefit of lab results. Facts about Danny Hansford were beginning to circulate, and they led credence to Williams' claim of self-defense. Hansford had been in and out of juvenile homes and mental hospitals. He had dropped out of school in the 8th grade and had a history of violence and getting into trouble with the police. Williams himself had bailed him out of jail 9 times in the past 10 months. Skipper Dunn, a horticulturalist who had once lived in the same rooming house as Hansford, described him as a dangerous psychotic. "He was a berserker," Dunn said. "I saw him run amok twice, breaking things, reaching for knives. It took 2 people to pin him down. You could look into his eyes and see there was no person left, only rage and violence. It was easy to see that he might try and kill somebody one day." Hansford had once torn the door off its hinges in an effort to get to his sister and beat her up. His own mother had sworn out a police warrant against him, declaring that she was afraid he would do bodily harm to her and her family. In his interview with the Georgia Gazette, Williams described Hansford as severely disturbed. He said Hansford had once told him, "I'm alone in this world. Nobody cares about me. I don't have anything to live for." With a strange sort of detachment, Williams saw himself as Danny Hansford's saviour rather than his nemesis, much less his murderer. "I was determined to save him from himself," he said. "He had given up on being alive." Though Williams' view was unabashedly self-serving, it was compelling in its detail. Hansford had developed a fascination with death, he said. He would frequently go to Bonaventure Cemetery with friends and point to the grave markers and say the poor ones were for... He would frequently go to Bonaventure Cemetery with friends and point to the grave markers and say that the small ones were for poor people and the big ones for rich people, and that if he died in Mercer House, he would get a big one. Hansford had twice tried to commit suicide at Mercer House by taking drug overdoses. The second time he had written a note. If this stuff does the job, at least I'll get a decent tombstone. Williams had rushed him to hospital both times. All that was a matter of record. Beyond saying Danny Hansford was an employee, Williams never fully explained their relationship. But it soon became known that Hansford had been a part-time male hustler who loitered in the streets along Bull Square. Most people did not need to have the rest of the story spelled out for them. A few of William's friends, however, society ladies for the most part, discovered they had been completely in the dark. Millicent Moreland, an Ardsley Park hostess in blue blood, had known Williams for 30 years. Yet, when a friend called her to say Jim Williams has just shot and killed his lover, she was dumbstruck for two reasons, not just one. That statement left me absolutely gasping, Mrs. Moreland said. My friendship with Jim had been based on antiques and parties and social things. I simply wasn't aware of his other interests in life. Most of the social set were more worldly than Miss Moreland. Oh, we knew, said John Myers. Of course we knew. We weren't aware of the details, naturally, because Jim exercised discretion, which was the right thing to do. But all along we congratulated ourselves about Jim's social success because of what it seemed to say about us. We thought it proved Savannah was cosmopolitan, that we were sophisticated enough to accept a gay man socially. Mrs. Moreland remained loyal to Williams, but there were certain things that did trouble her, apart from the shooting itself. She was perplexed by a seemingly small detail in the rush of events that happened that night. Joe Goodman, she said. Who is he? I don't know him. I've never seen him in Jim's house, and yet he was the first person Jim called.